Hello, we're going to wrap up chapter 13, covering sensory and motor pathways first. So let me switch Aroni to my little screen share mode. This is the last slide that we were on. And these are the outcomes for this section. They're all posted already for you in your chapter guide or your weekly guide. There's some terminology that's associated with sensory pathways. You have the general senses. These are the things that do not have a specialized receptor. These are very general and they're felt all over the body: pain, temperature, touch, vibration, proprioception, which is like body position. The receptors are spread everywhere and they're relatively simple. Sensation is the information that's carried through that sensory pathway, and then perception is our conscious awareness. So what we're actually perceiving is a very small percentage of the information that's actually coming in, and that's all regulated by the thalamus. So here we go. Other sensory terminology include the receptive field. This is the area that's monitored by a single receptor. The larger the receptive field, the poorer the ability to localize the stimulus. This is something like the 2-point threshold. You might do this in lab. I'm not sure, because different classes do things differently. But if you have like 2 little pins and you put them on your arm, you'll have to have those pins pretty far apart in order for you to tell that there's actually 2 of them. Whereas if they're on your hand, they can be very, very close together, and you can still tell that it's 2 separate pins. That's because the receptive fields in your hands are much smaller than the receptive fields in the back of your arms. Makes sense, because our hands have lots of nerve endings in them to make them very sensitive and very mobile. So there's those receptive fields. Let's talk about the events along these pathways. Obviously, the first thing that has to happen is the depolarization of the receptor. This can either be a physical or a chemical stimulus, resulting in the graded potential, which can then cause that domino effect and cause that action potential. Conversion of a stimulus to a membrane potential is called transduction. So transduction is the first thing that has to happen. Then the action potential is generated, and that cell will depolarize. The greater degree of depolarization, the greater the frequency of action potentials. So if there's a very large stimulus, there's going to be several action potentials sent down that axon. Then there's propagation. The labeled line is the axons carrying information about one type of stimulus. The central nervous system is going to interpret that stimulus according to the nature of the axon on which it arrives. Not all axons are the same. Then the central nervous system is going to do some processing. It's going to occur at every single step along that labeled line, and the line may branch repeatedly, distributing the sensory information throughout several nuclei of the brain and several centers of the spinal cord and brain. So from the central nervous system processing, there's going to be involuntary motor pathways, which is an immediate involuntary response. This is the response before those sensations reach the cerebral cortex. That would be a reflex. Or they're going to be voluntary motor pathways. Only about 1% of arriving sensations are actually relayed to the primary sensory cortex where perception is occurred. Whoa. Only 1% of all the things that you are aware that you're feeling are relayed to your consciousness. So think about all the other inputs that you're getting into your body that you don't even pay attention to, that you're not even aware of. Like, I'm not aware right now, and you're not either, of your shirt on your body, right? Your touch receptors aren't firing just because you have a shirt on, right? It's there. You know it's there, but your brain doesn't need to be consciously reminded of it every second. So it's not told about it. The thalamus knows, but it's not reminding the cerebrum anymore. So the voluntary response is not immediate, and it can moderate or enhance or supplement some type of reflex. So sensory pathway, depolarization, right, transduction, action potential generated, labeled line gets propagated, central nervous system processing. There could be the immediate response or a voluntary motor pathway where it's perceived, and then we can override or increase some involuntary response as well. All the little individual slides, you can pause the video here, go back and review if you need to. Let's talk about some of these receptors. They can be free nerve endings. These are the simplest receptors. They are branching dendrites of some type of sensory nuclei. They're not protected by accessory structures. They extend through a tissue typically, and they respond to several different stimuli and inhibit very little receptor specificity. So pain sensations and chemicals and pressure can all be detected by these free nerve endings. It's the same impulse no matter what. And there's those free nerve endings. You also have nociceptors. Nociceptors are pain receptors. These are free nerve endings with a very large receptive field and very broad sensitivity. There are two types of axons that carry pain information. You have type A fibers, which are fast and myelinated, and type C fibers, which are slower and unmyelinated. Let's talk about those. Type A fibers are fast pain. This is a prickling pain. This is that sharp, ouch pain, right? A quick injection, a deep cut, quickly told to your brain, right? You can usually localize that stimulus right away. You know exactly where that mosquito bit you, or you know exactly where that bee stung you, or exactly where that piece of glass went into your foot, right? Type C fibers are slow, aching, burning pain. This is a belly ache, a back ache, right? This is a cramp. It's generalized pain. You're aware of the pain, but you can't really pinpoint, oh, it's right here, right? It's this whole area hurts. That's type C pain. Then you have thermoreceptors, which are, again, free nerve endings with temperature receptors on them. There are 3 to 4 times more cold receptors than warm receptors because it's a body defense mechanism, right? It's more important to keep your body warm, so we have to know when it gets too cold than if it gets too hot. Then we also have chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors are responding to water-soluble or lipid-soluble substances that are typically already dissolved in the body fluids like the blood, the interstitial fluid, or the CSF. Then you have mechanoreceptors. Mechanoreceptors are sensitive to stimuli that distort their plasma membranes. Membranes could be opened by stretching, compression, twisting, or any other distortions. It's going to cause those mechanically gated channels to open. There are 3 main types of mechanoreceptors. You have proprioreceptors for maintaining your body position, balance, things like that. Baroreceptors are pressure. This could be pressure within your digestive system, your respiratory system, your blood, your circulatory system. And then you also have tactile receptors. Tactile receptors are your touch receptors. You have fine touch and pressure receptors, and you have crude touch and pressure receptors. So here you see the breakdown of these guys. General sensory receptors, NOC can be type A or C. Thermo, mostly cold. Chemoreceptors, mechanoreceptors can be proprio, baro, or tactile. So let's talk about how our receptors are basically designed to fire. They could be tonic. Tonic receptors are always active. The frequency of generated action potentials is going to reflect the level of background stimulation. So if there's an increased stimulus, they're going to increase their frequency of firing. If there's a decreased stimulus, they're going to decrease their frequency of firing action potentials. Phasic receptors are also normally inactive. These will become active for a very short time in response to a monitored condition. So in other words, you go outside and there is a light breeze in the air, right? Your tonic receptors are going to know that, right? They're always active. But when that breeze picks up, all of a sudden you're like, whoa, your hair is blowing all over the place. Those are your phasic receptors that are activated for those few brief moments until you adjust, and then you're fine. Or when you get into a cold pool, tonic receptors feel it, but eventually become numb to it, and then maybe, you get out, and then you get back in, and then your phasic receptors are activated again. So here you see tonic versus phasic and their frequency of action potentials. Again, tonic are much more active. Tonic is just telling you when it has changed. Adaptation is your reduced sensitivity to some type of stimulus. So there's peripheral adaptation, which occurs when the receptor activity changes. So the receptor responds strongly at first, and then it doesn't respond anymore, or it gradually declines. Central adaptation occurs along sensory pathways within the central nervous system. It typically involves the inhibition of a nuclei within the sensory pathway. For instance, after exposure to a new smell, you almost don't even notice that it's there anymore. Or this is why you might not notice that your house has a smell to it. Like maybe other people smell your house and they smell dog and you don't smell it because you live there, or vice versa. There is 3 review questions here. You can pause the video, go back and review. Hope your house doesn't smell like dog, but I was just giving that as an example. Didn't mean to offend. Let's talk about some general sensory receptors. There's millions of them all over the body. They're mostly found in the skin. There's several types of tactile receptors on the skin. You have free nerve endings, the root hair plexus, the tactile disc, the tactile corpuscles, lemmallated corpuscles, and Ruffini corpuscles. So there they are. Again, I'm not going to give you a drawing and say which one is this. Your lab instructor might. Let's go over these. Free nerve endings. These are the branching tips of sensory neurons. They're very nonspecific. They respond to touch, pressure, pain, and temperature, and they're the most common receptors. There's the root hair plexus, which is connected to the root hair, and any distortion in the root hair is going to show that there is movement, and those root hair plexus is going to alert. These adapt very rapidly. This is most of the reason why you don't remember that your shirt is on you. Even the little hairs on your body are moving in response to that shirt. Your body doesn't have to know about it. Free nerve endings, root hair plexus. There's also tactile discs, which are also sometimes called Merkel discs. These detect fine touch and pressure. They're extremely sensitive tonic receptors, very small receptive fields. Merkel cells are usually large epithelial cells within the stratum basal, so they can actually be within that epidermis. And each Merkel cell has a tactile disc associated with it. So again, very, very sensitive. And tactile corpuscles, or Meissner's corpuscles, provide sensations for fine touch, pressure, and low frequency vibration. They adapt very, very quickly as well. They are the most abundant in the eyelids, fingertips, nipples, external genitalia. This is how you enjoy someone kissing you or something like that, because there's a lot of receptors in those areas. And they typically, whoops, I just went backwards. I was like, wait, I just said that. There they are, much bigger. And then finally, we have lemmallated or Pacinian corpuscles. I like to call them Pacinian corpuscles because these are sensitive to deep pressure, and the Pacific Ocean is very deep. I remember it. Fast adapting, so once you feel that deep pressure, you're not going to feel it anymore. Kind of like, I don't know, I'm sitting on this chair, and one of the reinforcements, it's like a cheap IKEA chair, one of the parts of the seat is digging into my leg. And when I first sit on the chair, I notice it and I'm like, oh, this chair sucks. But now I'm kind of numb to it. I'm like, fast adapting. I don't remember it anymore. Very large receptive field. And, whoops, sorry. These are found in the dermis of the skin, mammary glands, and external genitalia, superficial deep fascia and joint capsules, as well as the viscera, like pancreas, urethra, bladder. And there they are. Finally, Ruffini corpuscles. Ruffini corpuscles are sensitive to pressure and distortion of the deep dermis. Stretching of the skin is going to fire off your Ruffini corpuscles. Tonic receptors have very little adaptation, so the capsule surrounds basically a core of collagen fibers. Mixing with the surrounding dermis, they're attached to dendrites. When the dendrites are compressed, it's going to alter the activity of that myelinated fiber, sending the signal. Highly sensitive. You can pause the video here, go back and review this little section. Let's keep going into sensory pathways. There's something called a sensory homunculus that is mapped out on your primary sensory cortex. It's basically a functional map that's kind of a 2-scale image of all of the sensory receptors in your body. So in other words, if you have lots of sensory receptors in your hand, which we do, that area of your primary sensory cortex is very, very large. There's the spinothalamic pathway, which is branched into anterior and posterior. Anterior is carrying crude touch and pressure. Lateral is carrying pain and temperature. The spinothalamic pathway goes up to a 3rd order neuron. So the 1st order neuron is carrying information from the receptor to the spinal cord, And then the second order neuron is carrying that information from the posterior gray horn up to the thalamus. And then the third order neuron is carrying from the thalamus to the cortex. So that's all through the spinothalamic pathway, either anterior or lateral, depending on where in the body we've been touched. Then there's the posterior column pathway. The posterior column pathway is providing localized fine touch pressure vibration. This begins at the peripheral receptor and ends in the primary sensory cortex. And the sensory axons extend in what's called the medial fasciculus gracilis and lateral, I can never say this word, I call it the F word, lateral fasciculus cuneatus. They're just little tracks, that's all they are. The medial lemniscus tract leads from the nucleus gracilis to the nucleus cuneatus, located in the thalamus. So here you see what I mean. Coming in, this sensory reception, here's our first order neuron, synapsing here with our second order neuron within the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus of the medulla oblongata, and then going on up to our thalamus and ventral nuclei of the thalamus, and then synapsing to the third order neuron, going up to the primary sensory cortex. Here you can see that sensory homunculus. So you can see the hand, the face, the lips have lots and lots of sensory receptors on them. The spinocerebellar pathway is carrying proprioceptive information about position of our skeletal muscles, which ones are bent, which ones are stretched, etc. Posterior axons do not cross sides of the spinal cord, so they just go through the peduncle of the same side, and anterior axons do cross over to the opposite side. So here you see some of this action coming in through either the joint capsules or Golgi tendon organs, etc. Coming into the spinal cord, synapsing with the second order neuron, taking that information up through the medulla oblongata into our cerebellum. Spinocerebellar pathway. Spine, cerebellum. It's not tricky. And then here you see some of the other pathways, that posterior column, spinocerebellar, spinothalamic pathways located on a cross-section of the spinal cord. You can pause the video here, go back and review. Now let's talk about our motor pathways. We've talked about how it gets into the brain. Let's talk about how it gets out of the brain. Typically involves at least two motor neurons, an upper, which is where the cell body is in the central nervous system processing center, like the primary motor cortex, and a lower motor neuron, which is the cell body nucleus within the brainstem or the spinal cord. Typically, that upper motor neuron synapses on the lower and innervates that single motor unit of the skeletal muscle. There's a motor homunculus, just like there was a sensory homunculus. It's the functional map of the primary motor cortex, where everything's proportional according to the number of motor units for that part of the body. So our motor pathways, we have the corticospinal pathway, cortico, cortex, spinal, spine, right? So this is providing voluntary control over our skeletal muscles. Sometimes it's called the pyramidal system. Remember those pyramids of our cortex, because it begins with those pyramidal cells. Upper motor neurons begin at that primary motor cortex. Upper axons descend into the brainstem, spinal cord, synapse at the lower motor neurons that control the skeletal muscles. Of the corticospinal pathway, we have the corticobulbar tracts. The corticobulbar tracts, cortex to the brainstem, bulbar, brainstem. These synapse with the motor nuclei of cranial nerves. So this is providing conscious control over skeletal muscles that move our eye, our jaw, our face, and some of our neck and pharynx. The corticospinal tracts of the corticospinal tract pathway are providing conscious control over skeletal muscles. This is typically visible or coming from the medulla oblongata. So the majority of our corticospinal axons come out of the pyramids of our medulla oblongata. Here you see the corticospinal pathway, primary motor cortex, coming down through cerebral peduncle, through midbrain, through the corticospinal tracts of our medulla oblongata, and some have discosation, switching sides. Some of them do not. They go to the opposite side of the body and synapse with a lower motor neuron out to the skeletal muscles. Let's talk about the two main pathways for subconscious motor control or commands. There's the lateral pathway. The lateral pathway, this one's mostly concerned with like muscle tone, precise movements, the distal part of the limbs like fingers and toes. The red nucleus is in control of that. The axons on the opposite side of the brain are descending through what we call the rubrospinal tracts. all coming from the red nucleus, lateral pathway. Then you have the medial pathway. The medial pathway is primarily concerned with the neck, trunk, and proximal limbs. These are the neurons here are located in our vestibular nuclei, superior and inferior colliculi, which we've talked about already, and the reticular formation. The reticulospinal tracts contain axons of the upper motor neurons within the reticular formation. So the reticular formation is receiving input from almost every single ascending and descending pathway, and so it has extensive connections for control and relay of information. The vestibulospinal tracts begin with the vestibular nuclei of cranial nerve 8, which is vestibular cochlear nerve, and that is receiving sensory information from the inner ear about position and movement, and the response is going to be changes in head position, issuing motor commands of head, neck, eye, limbs, etc. Tectospinal tracts contain axons of upper motor neurons in the superior and inferior colliculi of the brain, of the midbrain. That prefix tecto, like the tectum and tegmentum, that's where it's coming from, responding to bright lights, sounds, sudden movements, loud noises. Again, that reflexive, what was that? What did I hear? Superior and inferior colliculi, all part of that midbrain. So there you just see all the different nuclei. Again, nuclei is just the cell bodies of a particular tract or a particular nerve bundle in the brain. There's lots of them, and these are just some of the important ones. You can pause the video here, go back and review these 3 questions. Let's keep going with how somatic motor responses are controlled. So obviously there's many nuclei within the spinal cord and the brain, and they're all involved, not all of them, but many of them are involved in controlling the skeletal muscle contractions. The closer the motor center is to the cerebral cortex, the more complex the motor activity is. So the cerebellum is involved in multiple levels. Let's look at some of the least to most complex. Brainstem and spinal cord, pons medulla oblongata, hypothalamus, all the way down to the cerebral cortex, which is the most complex level of control. There you see. Again, activities that are controlled by the brainstem and spinal cord, very basic, very simple. But then once we start to include some of these upper levels, now we're coordinating activities. Now we're adjusting things, or we're consciously controlling them with our own awareness and perception. So let's talk about how we prepare for movement. The decision to move begins with this relay of information. It starts with the frontal lobes. I'm going to pick my nose, right? So that's all done from my frontal lobe. The motor association areas have to figure out, okay, well, what does she have to do to pick her nose? The basal nuclei, the cerebellum, all of those are going to coordinate this movement. So decision is made. Motor areas are coordinated with the basal nuclei and the cerebellum. Maybe I decide I need to go get up and get, a glass of water because I've been talking forever. That would all, again, be initiated, relayed, and then coordinated, and then carried out. So performing a movement, as a movement begins, that information gets sent to the motor association areas, to the primary motor cortex, and the commands can be modified by feedback from the cerebellum and basal nuclei. So maybe I can't get up because or maybe I can't walk over there because there's all this stuff on the floor because, the ground's shaking, or there's something else going on that's preventing me from doing that. So the basal nuclei, the cerebellum, are going to adjust and monitor all of my movements as, maybe I'm walking around on a boat or something like that, right? The basal nuclei adjust those movement patterns by altering the pyramidal cell sensitivity, adjusting the corticospinal output. They're also going to change the excitatory and inhibitory output of the medial and lateral pathways, which overall is going to adjust how my limbs and how my body responds. The cerebellum monitors all that somatic sensory information and adjusts the motor output as needed. That output along the medial and lateral pathways is going to direct all those involuntary movements of muscles that I'm not aware of that need to move. So it's, again, a highly coordinated effort coming from the cerebral cortex. Those motor association areas contacting the primary motor cortex. It's a feedback between our basal nuclei, our cerebellum, and our primary motor cortex. They're all checking with each other, making sure everything is good to go, making sure that my legs are capable, making sure that the rest of my body is able to get up and move, and then eventually going through the corticospinal pathway to those lower motor neurons. So if there's damage to the primary motor cortex, well, the individuals can lose their ability to have fine motor control over their skeletal muscles. Some voluntary movements can still be controlled by the basal nuclei, but this is where you get someone that's kind of shaky and stumbly and not coordinated. The cerebellum can't fine-tune movements because of the corticospinal pathway would be inoperable at that point. Individuals' ability to stand, balance, and walk, all movements would be awkward and very, very poorly controlled. You can pause the video here, go back and answer these 3 questions. Let's talk about some disorders. There's something called referred pain. This is a sensation of pain in the part of the body other than what is actually hurt or injured. So when you feel the pain of a heart attack, you're feeling it down your left arm, even though it's your heart that's actually in pain, right? The visceral pain sensations can stimulate interneurons within a spinal segment through that spinal thalamic pathway. This is going to lead to stimulation of the primary sensory cortex, and so you feel the pain in that part of the body, like this guy. Hopefully he's not actually having a heart attack in that picture. Just a bad actor. Or maybe a good actor. I don't know. Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease results when the substantia nigra, part of the brain, are damaged or secrete less dopamine. So the basal nuclei become very active, adjusting muscle tone, producing stiffness and rigidity. So starting movements is very difficult for people with Parkinson's because your antagonistic muscle groups don't relax. You're kind of always in this state of contraction in all of your muscle groups. You have to be overpowered. So every part of the movement has to be voluntary, controlled effort, and concentration. Rabies is another one. Rabies is transmitted by a bite of a rabid animal. Bite injects the rabies virus into the peripheral tissues. The virus spreads to the axon terminals, and it's carried by the axons to the central nervous system and can have potentially fatal results. Many toxins, pathogenic bacteria, and other viruses can bypass the central nervous system defense mechanisms through what we call axoplasmic transport, meaning they travel through the nerves themselves instead of through the blood. Cerebral palsy is a number of disorders that can affect voluntary motor control and voluntary motor movement. This typically motor dysfunction is non-progressive. It appears during infancy of childhood and persists throughout life. The cause may be trauma with premature or stressful birth, maternal exposure to drugs, or some type of genetic defect causing some improper motor pathway to develop. There's also ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Stephen Hawking also has it. It's progressive degenerative disorder. It affects your motor neurons of your brainstem and cerebrum, upper and lower neurons, causes atrophy of your skeletal muscles because those motor neurons are not stimulating the skeletal muscles, and it's thought to be related to a defect in axonal transport. There's Lou Gehrig. And Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is another progressive disorder characterized by loss of high-order cerebral functions. It's the most common form of senile dementia or senility. Symptoms can typically appear around ages 50 and 60, but it can also appear in younger individuals. An estimated 2 million people in the United States have it. Alzheimer's disease patients have intracellular and extracellular abnormalities of their hippocampus, which affects their memory, processing, and recall. You also have MS, or multiple sclerosis. It's a disease characterized by recurrent incidents of demyelinating axons, typically within the optic nerve of the brain and the spinal cord. Common symptoms include partial loss of vision, problems with speech, balance, or general motor coordination, like urinary and bowel control would be in that as well. The time between incidents and degree of recovery can vary from case to case. The first attack can occur in 30 to 40 years old, and it's more common in women. There's those demyelinating neurons of MS. And your last slide of the lecture, you can stop the video, review, answer these questions, and let me know if you have specific questions about the brain or motor and sensory pathways. I always speak really fast because it's hard for me to, do stuff without like a big chalkboard and everything that I would normally have for lecture or whiteboard, I guess I would normally have in a lecture room, because I'm just here in my office. But hopefully you find these videos more helpful than not having the videos. That's why I do them for you. So please post on the discussion page if you have questions, and I will answer them, and your classmates can answer them, and we can all learn together. All right. Have a great night. Bye.